Welcome to this video on trench warfare. In this video, we'll take a closer look at one of the most brutal and grueling forms of warfare in history. Trench warfare is perhaps most famously associated with World War I, where it was the dominant form of warfare on the Western Front. But it has been used in many other conflicts throughout history, from the American Civil War to the Korean War. So, what exactly is trench warfare? At its most basic level, trench warfare involves soldiers digging deep fortified ditches, or trenches, in which to shelter from enemy fire. These trenches were often complex systems, consisting of multiple layers and different types of trenches, including frontline trenches, support trenches, and reserve trenches. Digging these trenches was back-breaking work, often done under heavy enemy fire. Once the trenches were dug, soldiers had to live in them for days, weeks, or even months at a time. Life in the trenches was a constant struggle. Soldiers were exposed to the elements and often lived in squalid, unsanitary conditions. They were plagued by disease and often suffered from malnutrition. And if that wasn't bad enough, soldiers were also under constant threat of enemy attack. Poison gas, artillery barrages, and infantry assaults were a constant danger, and soldiers had to be constantly on their guard. Despite these challenges, soldiers in the trenches developed a range of tactics and technologies to help them survive. Machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire were all used to deadly effect. And in close combat, soldiers used a range of improvised weapons, such as trench clubs and bayonets. But perhaps the most famous image of trench warfare is that of soldiers going over the top, charging out of their trenches and into no man's land, in an attempt to break through enemy lines. Unfortunately, these attacks were often unsuccessful, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides, and when soldiers weren't fighting, they were often burying their dead. The constant exposure to death and destruction took a heavy toll on the mental health of soldiers, many of whom suffered from what we would now recognize as PTSD. Despite all of this, soldiers in the trenches tried to find ways to cope. They played games, wrote letters home, and even found moments of humor in the midst of the horror. One of the most famous examples of this was the Christmas Truce of 1914, when soldiers on both sides of the Western Front laid down their weapons and celebrated the holiday.